Kaikeyi, Part 2, Chapter 8. There are those who would blame Manthara for what I did, claim that she forced me to take her to Ayodhya and manipulated me from there. But my choices were my own, and to pull Manthara's name down with mine would be quite simply cruel. Because without Manthara's continued presence by my side, I would have never ridden off to battle or saved the king, and Koshala would have fallen, airless into the depths of time. My first impression of Ayodhya was one of beauty. The sight of the palace and the grounds completely arrested me. A lush expanse of greenery sprawled to the edges of the walls, dotted with gracefully curving paths, framed by a rich profusion of flowers. Their fragrance perfumed the air, rose and jasmine mingling into a gentle and welcoming scent. It was a marked change from the tall grass and the simple and unadorned layers of Kaikeyi. Before me, the palace rose upward, constructed out of light grey stone that glinted here and there in the light, as though infused with gems. It was crowned by a curved dome that pointed toward the sky, proclaiming Ayodhya's power for all to see. And the size, the ground stretched outward, extending like an unfurled flower. A series of delicate open arches surrounded the interior of the palace, lending the structure depth. I took a few steps closer and was able to make out intricate carvings above the arches, patterns of intertwined stars and moons. Above the arches, I could see large windows covered in paper that must have let in much light during the day. Now I could understand why others had found my old home, with its dull stone and stark decoration, dark and foreboding. Just the sight of this place lightened my spirits. "Do you like it?" Dashrath asked, smiling at me. I nodded eagerly. "It's incredible." I followed behind him in a daze, reveling in the tapestry-covered halls. In Kaikeyi, the fashion had been black figures patterned against a single color, when tapestries were hung at all. But here it was all I could do to not stop and stare at each of the colorful scenes laid out in the weavings before me. One was done in such vibrant hues of blue and green that I had to pause to look more closely. It was an image of a great fish pulling a boat. I recognized the story of Matsya and Manu. Manu was a young man, a chief of a tribe, when he discovered a small fish in his drinking water, Matsya. Manu was a kind man, and when Matsya spoke of his fear of being eaten by bigger fish, Manu offered his protection. When the fish grew large enough to be safe, Manu released Matsya into a river. Before he left, Matsya instructed Manu to build a boat and board it on an appointed day. No sooner had Manu finished the boat and ushered his family onto it than a great flood swept through the land, destroying all in its path. But Matsya returned to Manu, carrying him to the safety of the Indra mountains until the water had receded. There Matsya revealed his true form, for he was no ordinary fish, but an avatar of Lord Vishnu, come to earth, and he was rewarding Manu for his kindness. It was fitting to see this tapestry here, for legend tells that when Manu descended from the mountains, he founded the first city of men, Ayodhya. "It's one of my favorite stories," Dashrath said, coming to stand beside me. "The story of our city. I used to love it as a child. I suddenly wished to tell him about the library cellar, about sitting in the flickering light with my mother and reading through scrolls, but I found myself unable to share this piece of me. Still, our golden bond seemed to sparkle a bit more brightly." "Are there any other stories you enjoyed?" We could have a tapestry made for you," he offered. I shook my head. I was far too overwhelmed to think up other tales I might want to see. But it was a kind offer, and I was glad for his kindness. Dashrath walked slowly after that, letting me take in the sights until we arrived at the left wing of the palace. Fresh garlands of small white mogra hung from the walls, enveloping the whole corridor in sweetness. I wondered if this is how all the halls were adorned every day, or if they had made special preparations for my arrival. My husband threw open the doors of a vast chamber with great papered window on the opposite wall that let light into all corners. It was a strange living space, though, for I could see no bed. As I hesitated, fumbling for what to say, Dasharath said, "Do you not wish to see the rest?" "The rest?" I echoed, and he beckoned in me inward. I realized only then, stupidly perhaps, that there were carved doors set in the walls on either side of us. The one on the left opened into a spacious chamber dominated by a great bed that 4 people easily could have slept on. A covering of dark red wool warmed the floor, and an exquisite wooden cabinet inlaid with intricate swirls of mother of pearl stood against the wall. I touched the decoration with my fingertips, tracing the carved vines and flowers. "Do you like it?" he asked. "It is beautiful," I said, unable to wrench my gaze away. "Not unlike you, then." His voice was filled with a quality entirely foreign to me. I turned to look at him, but he was already striding past me, through the main room and onto the other side. There he revealed a small chamber, mostly taken up by a table and a cushioned seating. "If there's anything you need, you can ask any of our servants." He sounded nervous or perhaps impatient. "Thank you, my lord," I said with a bow. "You honor me. I'm sure you have more important matters to attend to." "The happiness of my wife is one of the most important matters I can think of." He gave me a small smile. "I will leave you now, but not for long." Mantra was waiting outside the door, only entering when Dasharath had departed. I went back into the bedchamber, marveling at the space while she examined every nook and sill. "He has done well," she said at last. "Now I must find some maidservants to help you prepare. Of course, you'll have to choose your own staff eventually." Mantra bustled about, talking of preparations as I sat and pondered about what this new life might have to offer. The next morning, Mantra and I set ourselves to the task of turning my quarters into a living space. My belongings had been moved into the room, and as Mantra unpacked, I cast a critical eye over each item I had brought, having taken in the opulence of Dasharath's court. All my best outfits appeared frumpy in comparison to the elegant Eastern fashions. I tried to recapture my confidence from the day I had been adorned to meet Dasharath, the glimpse of my mother, the assurance to hold my head high. But I could not. I might have been worthy to be a Radni in Kaikeyi, but here I lifted one blouse which extended past my waistline. "Not one woman wore a blouse this long," I said. "You can get it hemmed," Mantra answered without looking up from her work, "or have new ones ordered." I picked one of my favorite saris, a lovely sky blue thing that I had secretly believed had always suited me so well. "This color is so dull." "You've never cared much about such matters before," Mantra said. "Where is this concern coming from?" "I never had to worry about whether what I wore was in fashion before. I want the court to like me, not see me as backward," I replied. "They will like you," Mantra said, as a knock sounded on the door. I liked the sound of it, the solidity of the wood of the door, and the slight echo that spoke to the size of my room. Mantra went to receive the caller while I stood by my bed, still considering what I would wear in the evening's court assembly. "I apologize, but the Rajni is busy," I heard Mantra say. "I won't be but a moment." The woman's voice sounded familiar, and I gave up on making a decision, dropping the fabric in a bundle and entering the main room in a plain cream dress, only to find Radhini Kaushalya. I panicked and bowed to her, before realizing I did not need to do any such thing, and straightened so abruptly that I stumbled forward a step. My face flushed with heat, and Kaushalya's lips twisted into a barely concealed smirk. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," I whispered, embarrassment making me curt. She lifted a single eyebrow and nodded. "You honor me with your presence. Won't you come inside?" She stepped into the main room, the scent of the sandalwood sweeping in with her, and glanced around. Kaushalya was Dasharath's first Rajni. She stood a head above me, but her graceful neck and perfect posture made her seem even taller. The drape of her rich orange sari suggested soft womanly curves, at odds with her sharp bun and cutting cheekbones. Garnets glinted at her throat, setting off her luminous skin, The effect was so lovely that I wished to hide myself behind a curtain to avoid any attempt at comparison between us. It's quite bare, she said. No different than my rooms back home, I said immediately. Before I could give offense, I hastily added, but these are much bigger. Kaushalya turned to look at me, brow furrowed. Somehow, even that was elegant. This is your home now. She sounded kind, but I sensed an undercurrent of disapproval. I bit my tongue, annoyed that somehow every word I had said so far had come out completely wrong. Do you need assistance? Perhaps her offer was genuine, but in that moment it seemed like a challenge. She believed me a simpleton, a bumbling fool. No, I'm perfectly fine on my own. I straightened my shoulders and met her eyes. I see, she said. She glanced me up and down, then gave a half little shrug, casting me back into my girlhood and all my early interactions with the Kaikeyi court. My cheeks burned. I suppose you have no need of me then. She turned neatly on her heel and departed, leaving me bewildered at the exchange. I entered the binding plane and found only a slim wisp of black between us. I grasped it, hoping to leave her with the impression that this conversation had not been a complete disaster. But even the slight brush of my mind against the cord caused it to tremble, so I withdrew. I've never been in this situation before where my body was so tremulous that I could not even attempt my usual methods of influencing people. I felt small, useless, as though I was 12 years old and without my mother for the first time, unable to comprehend the palace without her. I soon discovered the same was true for Radni Sumitra, who had invited me to take my afternoon refreshments in her rooms. I assumed this would be very much same as the gatherings I had attended in Kaikeyi, with several noble women and much gossip. Instead, it was just Sumitra and I perched on delicate chairs, her watching me as I tried not to marvel at her rooms. They were laid out in similar fashion to mine, but bursting with colorful ornaments, beautifully painted clay lamps, and divans adorned with emerald colored cushions, all giving the place a full and joyful feeling. How have you been settling in? She asked. Unlike Kaushalya, Sumitra smelled of rose water and her clothes was always in light pastel shades. Today she wore blush. She was much less intimidating figure, but her easy cheer still set me off balance. I gave her a small sign. Well, and you? I'm glad to have you here, she said. She was only a few years older than I, but seemed to know so much more. Do you need anything? I know all of this can be overwhelming at first, especially for one as young as you. I'd been with her for all of 3 minutes and already it felt like she was poking fun at me. Had Kaushalya told her about our first meeting? Did she think I was some naive Yuvrajni? I assure you I'm fine. I'm happy to introduce you to people, if you would like, she pressed on. It would have been so nice to have someone guide me on, to tell me who and what I needed to know. And yet, would she not think me weak to admitting so? Perhaps, I said, hoping not to seem too eager. I was desperate for her to think of me as independent. But instead, Sumitra's brow furrowed briefly behind her expression. At your convenience, then, her voice had taken on a distance. In the binding plane, our silver bond was as wispy as cotton. It was no better with the other courtiers. I wondered if Kaushalya had spread rumors about me, or if the same things that had made me so off-putting to her was apparent to the rest of the court. I could barely touch any of my new Ayodhyan connections with my mind, for fear of accidentally snapping them. They could not have been of any real use to me. After a few awkward, failed attempts at conversation with even lower nobility, I resigned myself to loneliness. Everyone remained polite, of course, greeting me at court, and if they passed me in the corridors, but they did not seek me out or try to gain favor. Word spread, I'm sure, of the strangeness of Dasharat's new Rajni. When I was able, I wandered the palace halls, learning my new home as best as I could on my own. I occasionally attended Dasharath's open courts in the main hall, seated in the balcony with other women, or skirted the training fields when the men were too engrossed in practice to notice me. I made appearances at celebrations and rituals, observing all the rites of the gods, knowing full well it could not help me even in this new land. I attended evening dance performances in the elegant main courtyard, a practice that had been confined to tables in Kaikeyi, and admired the talent of those men who floated despite the weight of bells on their ankles, arms extending towards the sky, spinning and leaping as they told wordless stories that made my heart ache. I even tried to search out the library, but the cellars were hard to find in Ayodhya. I discovered one near the kitchens, but it was filled with food, not scrolls. A servant happened upon me and hovered at my elbow, clearly wishing for me to leave. Fearful I would gain a reputation for being a glutton or a nuisance, I stopped searching. Dasharath was the only person Ayodhya regularly spoke with, other than Mantra, for he summoned me to his rooms at least once a week, save when I was bleeding. The first time he kissed me on our wedding night, I flinched away and he laughed, presumably finding my strange virgin behavior endearing and amusing. The next time he kissed me on my third night in Ayodhya, my body bucked involuntarily, and in desperation I had tried to use a cord to stop him. He did not find it endearing the second time. "Surely you cannot be surprised now," he had said, his voice gentle but firm. "You are the one who wanted a son." The look on his face worried me, for I needed him to at least like me, and so I held myself stiff but did not move away. After several weeks in Ayodhya, I had become accustomed enough to his attentions that I had learned to mime the correct response, even though I did not understand why it was necessary. Our bond was not yet strong enough for me to influence or redirect his desires. Perhaps it never would be. So I'd bear his kissing for a few minutes, and then he would lead me by the hand towards the bed. He would set to my clothes with a brisk efficiency, the pleats of my sari unraveling under his hands as I stood still as a statue. He thought me submissive and meek in the bedroom, but that was better than him sensing my disinterest in the acts he wished to perform. "It does not matter what you feel for him," Mantra told me one week before my wedding. "All that matters is what he thinks you feel for him, and perhaps in time you will grow to like him." "I will never like it," I had said then. Mantra had only chuckled. "That matters very little when you are a Radni." And she was right, for although I had no appetite for such things, I pretended to, and he pretended to care about what I felt, using his body and on a few occasions his tongue. In a way, I was thankful that I had a kind husband, one who at least wished for my pleasure as well as his. I knew I could have done far worse than this. And yet sometimes I found myself wishing that I did care for him in this way, that I could give myself at least this duty of Radni. Men were allowed to be more open with their desires, but I had, of course, heard women speak of the wanting that accompanied marriage. They had all made such desires seem like one of the most important parts of being husband and wife. But I lacked it. What did that make my marriage? Once I came to Dasharath earlier than he had expected, and when he did not open the door, I let myself in. It was an old habit, formed by years of entering my brother's rooms without warning. I found him poring over a cloth laid out on a large table. I approached it curious and saw a very detailed map of Koshala, beautifully and precisely inked, depicting the settlements within the kingdom. I took a step closer, and at my movement, Dasharath glanced up. "Kaikeyi, I did not expect you so soon." "I apologize for disturbing you, Raja," I said immediately. "I can leave if you're occupied." He shook his head, smoothing out the map with one hand. "I was merely thinking." I stared at the map for several moments more, taking it all in. I had seen versions of such maps in Kaikeyi in the library cellar, but had never had the opportunity to study a map of Koshala. My eyes were immediately drawn to where the kingdom's borders began, just east of the Saraswati River, although to look at this map, the area was no longer well populated. Despite my brother telling me about the might of Koshala and my own distant awareness of it as our southeastern neighbor, I had not had a true awareness of how vast my husband's kingdom truly was. The Indra Mountains ran diagonally across the top of Bharat, forming the northernmost borders of Kekaya and Koshala, which divided at the source of the Saraswati River, high up in the mountain peaks. But in addition to the section of the Indra Mountains within Koshala's control, its borders encompassed an entire mountain range to the south, as well as several cities beyond even that. I swept my eyes over the map again, a bit awed. A cluster of red markings just to the north of Koshala's borders caught my attention. I peered closer to find dashed arrows from villages at the foothills of the Indra mountains, running in and out of Koshala's borders. Raids, it seems. Who are they? I asked, brushing my fingertips against the shading. I worried perhaps I was being too forward, but I didn't wish to stop. I had not had any real conversation with my husband since our unexpected moment in the throne room so long ago. He raised an eyebrow. You read that quite fast. Thank you, I said, uncertain. Dasharath's eyes flicked up to my face before looking down at the map with a sigh. It is a newer kingdom, or at least they proclaim themselves to be a kingdom. In reality, they're just a collection of villages united by the warlord Sambarasura, who has promised them a share of Koshala's riches if they only arm themselves. They've been targeting trade routes, I observed. Yes, but you see here? He pointed to a cluster of villages next to the river Ganga, and when I looked closer, I saw annotations. Burned, 30 dead, harvest ruined. They've made several forays into our farming towns and are growing more and more violent. Stealing is one thing, but this... He shook his head. This time Dasharath actually studied my face, and I could see him losing interest in the conversation as he remembered why I was here. You do not need to worry, he said, coming around the table to take my hand. It will be taken care of. All right, I told him. Koshala is my home now too. I wanted to add, if there is anything I can do, but no, it was not worth going down that path. After all, what could he possibly need from me? Without Manthara, I might have never survived those first few months. In the privacy of my rooms, free from the restrictive dress and the formal speech of court, I was often too dispirited to do anything but spend hours lying in bed. Manthara would sit patiently beside me, embroidering and teaching me the names and roles of nobility I was certain I would never meet. Once she even offered to practice swordplay with me as we used to do. I could tell from a glance at the blinding plane that she did not really want to, and it made me realize just how worried she was about me. So I rose from the bed to stretch and then lift objects and review the footwork Yutajit had once taught me. But when Manthara was not around, I would lie back in bed and enter the binding plane and stare at the strings, despairing at how I had become so useless quickly. If there was other magic out there, something that might help me to become a part of this foreign place, it was within the purview of the gods. I was alone. On one such day, she returned early from whatever work she did in the palace and found me lying in bed once again. Where before she often viewed me with sympathy, instead she clucked her tongue at me. Get up, she ordered. I was so surprised to hear this tone in her voice, one that had been missing for so long, that I obeyed instantly. Wear your pale blue sari, the one from Kaikeyi. The court will laugh, I muttered. We are not going to court. Her voice brooked no argument, so I dressed myself, intrigued despite the fog that still surrounded me. I followed her down the hallway to a small door, presumably the entrance to a servant's passage designed to help them move more quickly through the palace. After descending a rickety stair and navigating a short maze of walkways, Manthara pushed open a door, giving a quick nod to the guard stationed there. He just yawned, barely glancing in our direction. We had emerged onto a small side alley on the other side of the palace wall. What? I began turning around, but Manthara gripped my arm and pulled me out of the alley into a bustling road. This was nothing like Kaikeyi, where the quarters nearest the palace were sparsely populated. Here, just beyond the palace, merchants sold their wares to the streams of city dwellers passing by on their business. Manthara's arm snaked around my shoulders, and she pulled the pallu of my sari up so the cloth covered my head. I have been asked to buy some things by the ladies of the palace. I do not work for them, of course, but it is good to do them favors from time to time. I thought you might want to accompany me. Stay close. We set off, and I felt almost giddy to be swept up in the bustle. The thoroughfare next to the palace let out quickly into a large open square. Mantra approached one man who had laid out a gorgeous array of glass bangles in a rainbow of hues. I watched as Mantra haggled for a few minutes before sweeping up a collection, deep crimson and cobalt and saffron all glinting in the sunlight. What need have noble women of those? I asked. The bangles were lovely, but not the type of thing the fine women of court arrayed themselves in. Trinkets for their children or grandchildren, Mantra said. They do not have the money to let small fingers break their precious objects, wealthy though they may be. At another stall, Mantra stopped to buy a bundle of fragrant dried herbs. She carded through the selection with deft fingers before alighting on one that looked to me the same as the others. Can these be mixed with milk? She asked. Of course, the man said briskly. Are you sure? Mantra pressed. I've heard complaints of stomach pain after doing so, and I do not want to displease my mistress. Yes, he insisted, just as another voice said, no. A woman who had been crouched next to the stall and tending to a brazier that led off a smoky aroma rose to her feet. Those should not be taken with milk. You are correct that it can sometimes cause digestive upset, and in that case, won't take effect. The man darted out, quick as a cobra, landing a slap on the back of the woman's head. Did I ask you? He hissed. Flinching, she shook her head and silently squatted back down to her work. To Mantra, the man said, forgive her, she doesn't know her place. As I was saying, the herbs can be taken with or without milk, but if your mistress has difficulties with milk, there's no harm in trying without. Mantra's mouth was pursed in a thin line of displeasure, and she haggled with the man for far longer than she had at the previous stall before exchanging the herbs for a scant few coins and moving on. As we pressed farther into the square, I turned back to look at the woman. I thought perhaps I would find her crying, but she was staring down at her brazier, turning the drying stems of her plants carefully as if nothing had happened. I had never been taken to a marketplace in Kaikeyi, and I was grateful to have a chance to witness such a thing in Ayodhya. The market people seemed full of chaos and possibility. People shouted and bartered their anger at a bad bargain or pleasure at good craftsmanship flowing freely. There was something alive about this place, and yet, as I swept my gaze over the stalls, I saw not a single woman standing alone behind one. There were women, to be sure, folding fabric, rearranging their goods in preparation for customers, but all were accompanied by men, and none seemed in control. Kaikeyi, Mantra said softly in my ear. Are you ready to go? Is it always like this? I asked. Today is the busiest day of the week, she said, misunderstanding my question, but that means the best wares are on offer. There was nothing amiss to Mantra, I realized. Why would there be? Even in palaces, women were rarely heard. The gods did not wish for women and men to mingle overly much. And even in Kaikeyi, the sages had created rules to keep such order in place. I could not expect any different outside the palace walls, and yet I found myself hoping that the market, this place so full of life, might be better. In that moment, I felt like the old Kaikeyi, who had convinced her brother to teach her to fight and had negotiated the terms of her marriage. I could see myself again, just within reach.